Let's look at an unusual French heavy cavalry palash with a twist. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now my day job, apart from being a YouTuber, is running an antiques company. I sell antique swords, Easton Antique Arms, links down below. And I get some interesting swords through my hands, and this is one of them. Now at first sight, I bought this on the basis that it was a French palash or heavy cavalry sword, a dragoon model. So for heavy cavalry, I'll talk about how you recognise those in a second. It's the 1854 version. So many of you will have seen my previous videos that I've done on the cuirassier palash, the famous heavy cavalry palash that the French heavy cavalry used. If you've ever seen the movie Waterloo, or you've seen pictures or done wargaming where you've seen the French cuirassiers, they were using that model of sword in the Napoleonic period. But they kept this basic type of sword into the 19th century, and by 1854 there was a new model, and this is the model of 1854. So when I bought this, based on the photos I had available to me, I thought it was a standard 1854 pattern French heavy cavalry sword, a perfectly nice sword. That's why I was buying it for stock to sell through my website, which it is now sold incidentally. But when it came to me, a curious thing. Now, I'll get to that in a second. First of all, what are the basic features? Let's look at its features. So the way you recognize these things is, first of all, they are long and straight. Okay, so a lot of French cavalry swords are curved. There's a model of 1822, for example, but this has a long, straight blade. We'll look at the blade in a second, but you can see already in the scabbard. And the other way you can recognise it, you'll notice that the hilt, for anyone who looks at US Civil War swords, for example, for anyone who doesn't know, American swords of the Civil War are based on French swords. Okay, in fact, the uniforms, the Union uniforms, are also largely based on French uniforms. So in the middle of the 19th century, the French military was regarded as par excellence and for everyone to copy. So lots of people copied French style uniforms and swords. So the French copied, the Americans copied them. So if you look at the American cavalry swords, the model of 1840 and then the model of 1860, they're modelled on the French 1822. And indeed, even the infantry officers' swords and the artillery sort of gladius type sword are all modelled on French military. Right, back to the French. So you can also recognise it because although it has a hilt that looks a bit like the standard 1822 with this sort of pommel cap made of brass and this sort of plate element to it here which protects the front of the hand if you're thrusting, for example, you've got these branches at the side, commonly referred to as side bars. And you'll notice instead of the usual 2 bars, it has 3 bars. So the instant way, even if you can just only see a hilt, if you've got 3 bars on the side instead of 2, it's usually, like 99% of the time, a heavy cavalry sword. There are a few weird non-regulation exceptions, but generally speaking, heavy cavalry. Okay, so we can recognize it's heavy cavalry from the hilt and then also the long straight blade. Now we pull the blade out, you'll notice, and I have showed these cuirassier blades before, they have a characteristic double fuller. Okay, now the advantage of the double fuller is it makes for a very rigid and stiff blade. They kind of suck for cutting, but that wasn't what they were intended for. They were intended for thrusting while the horse is moving at speed and using it a bit like a short lance, essentially. So they aren't great cutting swords. Because of those double fullers, it produces too much friction trying to cut through a target. You can cut with them and they do have an edge, but they just aren't very good at cutting. But moreover, they're not very easy to sharpen because you have the edge is, as you can see here, is only a very small portion of the front of the blade. So you've got, just put the sword down for a second, instead of with a sword which has a more gradual bevel, so a smaller angle, you essentially are squishing the space for the edge into a smaller space and therefore the angle becomes more broad and wider angle. So although you can sharpen these edges, and this is in fact service sharpened, and I'll tell you about why in a second, this is a broad enough angle that it kind of sucks at cutting. So yes, you can smack someone really hard on the head or the arm and put them out of action, but it's never going to be a very good cut. It's primarily a thruster. Now, let's get back to the twist. So I got this sword and it looked completely standard 1854 pattern heavy cavalry dragoon sabre. And in fact, looking at the spine of the blade here, you won't be able to see unfortunately, but it says here that it was manufactured, it's that way around, but manufactured at the factory of Châtellerault. There were a few different official French arms factories, but one of the biggest ones was Châtellerault, the other one was Klingenthal. There was also Saint-Étienne as well, but it was manufactured at Châtellerault in February 1865. Great, and it says dragoon model of 1854, so it tells you even what model it is. So that's all fine, okay, but as soon as I pulled the sword out of the scabbard, I immediately noticed something weird. I was like, where's the rest of the blade? It's been shortened. Now, it's not a short sword, it's still a normal length sword. So that blade is 32 inches long. You can convert that to metric, I can't off the top of my head. But you'll notice that the scabbard is considerably longer than the blade. Now, initially, I thought, oh damn, you sometimes find this when a blade has been broken and then re-pointed. But I looked at the patina, and the patina is the oxidization on the blade. And it's exactly the same all the way to the tip. So this was shortened and re-tipped, in other words, a point put back on it after it had been shortened, in period. And the service sharpening, because it's got a decent edge, it's got a couple of little nicks in the blade, has also got patina on it. So the edge and the point were done a long time ago, not recently. So this isn't a recently repaired sword, this is a sword that was shortened in period. So I thought that's a bit odd, and initially I put it up on the website going, this is a shortened one, I don't really know what's being shortened. Now, a couple of people then got in contact with me and pointed out some details about this, and the one I'm going to credit with giving the explanation for this to me is Maxime Chounard, who you might know, and he's probably going to be on the channel at some point because he does Irish stick fighting and a bunch of other interesting things to do with antique swords like I do. And he knows a lot more about French swords than me because I'm primarily a British sword dealer and medieval and Renaissance sword person. I don't know a huge amount about the French military. But here's the thing. So in 1870, there was a rather important war, the Franco-Prussian War, sometimes known simply as the War of 1870. Now, many people outside of continental Europe don't know much about the Franco-Prussian War, which is a great shame. It really should be taught in all schools. Certainly for anyone who learns about World War I, they should really have known about the War of 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, because in many ways, the Franco-Prussian War, in other words, the war between France and Prussia, which essentially later was very, very formulaic in creating what we now know as Germany, went to war, okay, and essentially Prussia invaded France and defeated France. There's no way around it. There was quite a lot of fighting. There was cavalry. It was more like a 19th century war than World War I was in many ways. Despite the fact that they had breech loading, very accurate rifles, there were huge cavalry actions, and it was a very interesting war, but fairly short, fairly conclusive. And a peace came out of that, but it wasn't really a satisfactory one. Ultimately, we could say that it laid the foundations for what happened in World War I. Right. And I should also mention as well that basically no other powers were involved. So unlike World War I, which obviously became a world war or the Great War, the Franco-Prussian War was more or less isolated between the French and the Germans, or the Prussians. But the British did give actually some support. They gave food and economic support to the French. So the British had already sided with the French by that point. Right, so the Franco-Prussian War. Now, because the Prussians won, the Prussians took loads of stuff from the French. And one of the things they took was this sword. So what's really interesting is this sword has a marking on the side here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on camera, but I will attempt to show you down there. And so you can see it's got a bunch of letters and numbers. And one of those things is GDC. Now, the French did have a garde du corps. But that was something from the Napoleonic period. In fact, by this period, they didn't. But the Prussians did. The Garde du Corps essentially were the bodyguard of the Kaiser. They were like cuirassiers, essentially. So what they did is when they captured these very nice French swords from the French heavy cavalry, they put them into service for the Prussian Kaiser. And you imagine there's many elements to this. First of all, they are good swords, and they are swords suitable for cuirassiers and a personal bodyguard. But also, it's also, I guess, a kind of like, well, look what we've got, because we gave you a drubbing last year and now we're wearing your swords as kind of trophies. So not only are they good swords, but they're also captured from the enemy. And French swords were very well made, they are very well made, and very highly regarded. So this sword was put into service for the Prussian Garde du Corps. Now we come to the blade length. So I had wondered why. Well, quite simply, the Prussians all the way through to the late 19th century models preferred slightly shorter swords. So the 1889 pattern, for example, has a 32, 33 inch blade. So presumably, and it's not 100% certain, but probably 90% certain, the reason this blade is shortened is because the Prussians shortened it. They didn't bother shortening the scabbard because no real need, but the Prussians, for whatever reason, thought that a shorter blade was better, more wieldable. And I have to say, the end result is a really nice, it's a much more nimble sword, much more manageable sword than the typical whopping great sort of 37 inch blade that these things normally come with, 36, 37 inch. So there we go, that's the story. So this is a sword that was carried almost certainly in the Franco-Prussian War, or at least captured in the Franco-Prussian War. I suppose theoretically it could have been captured from an armory or an arsenal or something, but by and large I think it was probably captured from enemy troops. The Prussians, the Kaiser, then pushed it into service in the Prussian army, and it was thereafter carried by the Garde du Corps, the personal bodyguard of the Kaiser. So there we go, a Franco-Prussian sword, which we almost certainly know was actually carried and used and captured in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. If you don't know about the Franco-Prussian War, go and type it into Google now and have a little read for 5 minutes, and you will have massively increased your understanding of modern Europe and the politics that led to World War I, and you could say therefore World War II as well. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and thanks again to Maxime Chouinard for sharing his wisdom, knowledge, and Pavel Pin as well as before him. And thanks for watching this video. If you're not subscribed, please click that button, and I hope you'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks!